I am, somehow, less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain than in the near certainty that people of equal talent have lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. Stephen Jay Gould. In the vastness of the inner sphere and in the depths of human history, genius is something that either withers or flourishes, depending on circumstance. Someone of sound mind and reason may be dubbed as mad, or heretical, for their observations of what to them is evident fact, and is by contrast to others something that breaks with tradition, dogma, or the common understandings of their time and place. Even more such examples of insight may be lost to humanity as a whole, unable to innovate or bring their imagination to life, due to the circumstances of their time and their position in society. Many a genius died building carriages or plowing fields, leaving their intellect wasted and their societies and themselves unable to benefit from it. This is almost always from the cruelty of the fates, determining the status of their lives. But there are those who are in the right place, at the right time, with the right resources and tools to change the face of their field of expertise, whether that be in the sciences, such as physics, biology, or mathematics, just to name a few, or even in creative fields such as writing, music, or art. In this overview, we are going to look at a series of mechs that emerged and changed the face of warfare. For centuries, these were viewed as flawed machines, but with time, there has been a small measure of appreciation passed towards them. So, let us delve into the masterpiece that could only be made by the greatest of minds. But before doing so, I wish to ask a question to all of you, in the spirit of the quote that has begun our journey. If there are so many potential great leaders, scientists, and creatives who died in farmers' fields, how many people of inhibited creativity and genius have discovered themselves in the roles of thinkers in their time? In this overview, we are going to discuss Dr. David Harrison's supposedly ingenious idea, something that actually started many manufacturers down a golden path, if only a short one. Quad Battlemechs. The 26th century was an era of innovation. It was a space and time of reimagining a variety of tried and tested ideas, refining them or challenging them altogether. This bold new age meant things began to transform rapidly and radically, and it had an impact across the human sphere societies at large. However, the military was truthfully the biggest benefactor in the process of economic and scientific evolution. Improvements were made in weaponry, engines, materials, and just about every kind of element related to battlemech or vehicle construction. This said nothing, too, of advancements made in other elements of military matters, like, for instance, the ever-infamous class of interstellar juggernauts, warships. Still, in this upswing in military spending and technological advancement made by the great powers of the inner sphere, a multitude of companies, without significant histories in battlemech or other forms of military production, began trying to get involved with the action. There were just too many opportunities at the time not to, as well as apparent holes in the market that were just waiting to be filled. In some cases, there were even new niches to still be created in the wide ecosystem of war, as mankind, to keep the supposed peace, began the process of arming itself, before the eventual rise of the SLDF. The scale of weapons procurement before and after the arrival of the Star League was staggering. The first real, significant divergence from bipedal battlemechs came from a company that had only recently become involved in the art and business of the core vehicles of the setting. Hollis Industries' first foray into Battlemech design and construction came in the form of the legendary Catapult, a 65-ton machine which is in many minds a staple as far as long-range support weapons are concerned. This 65-ton monster became a big, though short-term success for the newest entity to enter the fabled and illustrious cadre of Battlemech manufacturers during the 26th century. In fact, this missile-launching biped gave such a windfall to Hollis Industries, they opted to invest a huge portion of their profits into a new project, one headed by a young man who had a new, breakthrough way of thinking. This, as of yet unmade product, was to elevate Hollis Industries beyond their peers, and perhaps even change the very face and nature of warfare. A young Dr. David Harrison had near carte blanche when he was given the reins to the project he'd helmed in the 2540s. Hollis literally viewed him as a genius, an innovator no less, and the man who would drag their company into a leading position in the now flourishing Battlemech space. Harrison had long believed that the future of Battlemechs did not reside in mere bipeds, like the catapult he had been involved with. No, he had a vision for warfare where mechs did not fight on 2 legs, but on 4. The idea behind it was simple. A 4-legged Battlemech would be more stable in almost all terrain conditions, allowing it to act as a superior firing platform. Even better yet, the chassis type would be able to support even more armor than their 2-legged rivals. The only drawback behind the idea, in the mind of Dr. Harrison, was simply that their firing arcs would be more restricted than their bipedal competitors, due to the lack of twisting torsos or articulating arms. He'd conceived this idea, even as he worked on the catapult, until he refined a prototype of sorts for this plan in 2564. Certainly, Hollis believed in Harrison, but they'd not entirely bought into the idea of a quadruped mech, or at least they weren't willing to overly commit to it. This meant that he was working on this project, which came under the title of the XNT-20 Xanthos, and he was forced to use cheaper, more primitive components for the day for it. This was done for cost savings more than anything, as the company believed that the core ideas behind the quad mech shouldn't have been impacted by its use of things like an effective engine or modern materials. Harrison had a brilliant vision for these mechs, whether in their primitive forms or even their more advanced ones. In his mind's eye, he viewed these Battlemechs being deployed en masse, covering a wide battlefield, and simply steamrolling over all opposition. In perhaps his delusions, these quads were to act as a great wave of 100-ton monstrosities. Because of how he doctrinally viewed their usage, there was little reason to address the mech's weaknesses in regards to things like its flanks, especially given that the mech did not have proper arms, or the ability to twist easily to face enemies that slipped past them. All of these ideas seem to sound great on paper, really. But the only problem with all of this is that the mech wasn't ready, it would seem, at least not for the trials it was intended for, and Hollis were in need of money. After years of spending in the wake of the catapult's short-term success, the business was becoming increasingly concerned about its finances and spending on various projects, but most notably, this project. In fact, concerned might not be the right wording. Panicked. Yes, panicked is a more accurate terminology to use in this instance. What brought about this anxiety, you may be wondering? Well, the financial situation in the company was increasingly problematic, you see, because the Terran hegemony, their only legal market for their only military product, the catapult, as of the mid-26th century, cancelled all future procurements of said Battlemech. This came at an unfortunate moment for Harris, as one can imagine, as the XNT-20 was still very much in its teething phase. First things first, to delve into why this mech wasn't ready, The XNT-20 was made into a physical form, but it was far from actually stable or functional in this prototype stage. It had not had enough time to have all the bugs worked out, with the most damning flaw of all being that the mech could barely walk on anything outside of flat ground. Amusingly, Hollis, and by extension Harrison, had rejected any outside help, or even incorporating any outside technologies or know-how in the development process for the Xanthos, only further exaggerating the problems it was now experiencing at this early stage of its development. Under these conditions, desperate to get any revenue source to stop their financial hemorrhaging by once more acquiring a government contract, Hollis Industries submitted the XNT-20 Xanthos to the Hegemony Armed Forces for testing and review, as they had been interested in the idea of quad platforms, at least on paper. What unfolded was, as you can probably expect, not what Hollis Industries desired, as it was nothing short of a complete disaster. Dr. Harrison, with urgency and peril in his heart, tried to make last-minute changes to the mech, trying to help correct some of its movement problems before and during tests, but his efforts were in vain. The XNT-20 was marched out in front of civilian and military personnel from the Hegemony Armed Forces Review Board, and was figuratively slaughtered. The mech was clumsy and stiff, with many instances where even experienced pilots could not keep the machine standing upright. Realistic combat trials were even more damning. The mech was roundly rejected by the HAF, and later even conceptually by the fledgling Star League. This was for Hollis Industries a disaster. The company would struggle and nearly collapsed in the wake of the debacle, before Dr. Harrison moved on, humiliated from his experience trying to uplift four-legged mechs from a fledgling technology he'd pioneered into a mature, war-winning breakthrough advancement. However, when one fails, and fails with other people's money, they must try, and try again. What this is to say is that the good Dr. David Harrison was not done with four-legged machines yet, even if his time with the doomed Xanthos was. Surely, with this experience, he would achieve the revolution in military development he'd always envisioned. Genius cannot be rushed without consequences, after all. An assault mech weighing in at a massive 100 tons, the XNT-20 Xanthos is perhaps one of the biggest embarrassments of its time, and was so poorly received that it nearly caused the doom of its manufacturer, and of quad mechs as a concept. Using primitive components, which even for the mid-20th century were dated, one could hardly call this experimental quad anything but a disaster. Possessing a standard internal structure and gyro, these are about the only normal things in respect to its core components. Even its cockpit is primitive, and honestly that must have made it even more heinous for its pilots to operate, because by the way, it apparently wasn't fun to pilot. For its mobility, it comes stocked with a primitive 360 engine, which weighs a staggering 33 tons, and provides this lumbering creation with only the same performance as a 19-ton 300 standard engine, meaning it can only move 5 hexes at a run. Then it commits another grave sin, by being saddled with 15 tons of primitive armor, giving it only 160 points of defense, the equivalent of 10 tons of standard plating. For armaments, it comes with a stock AC-10, 2 medium lasers, a head-mounted small laser, and an SRM-4. It has 2 tons of ammunition for the autocannon, and 1 ton of ammunition for the SRM-4. It also has a rear-firing small laser. To say the least, at the era of its introduction, when put in competition with mechs like the Longbow, Thunderbolt, or any other number of decent simple mechs of this time, the Xanthos just doesn't compare. What's worse, however, was this thing's quirks. It has bad reputation, understandably. Poor performance, meaning it cannot go into a full run from a standing position. Protected actuators, prototype, and unbalanced. This mech was indeed quite cursed. it would have struggled to fight even the Mackie, which was old by this time. There's a reason why this prototype, despite not being fully cooked, was rejected out of hand. Before we go much further, just because rare mech types such as protomechs, quads, quad-Vs, tripods, and LAMs tend to have variances in their rule sets, I think it is important to mention what makes a quad mech a quad mech. The first and foremost point is that they do, indeed, have 4 legs, and as a result don't possess arms. When receiving fire, the 4 legs simply take the damage that would have normally been applied to the arm that they replaced. This is also true upon torso loss, because if a side torso is lost for a quad mech, the front forelimb will be removed along with the now missing torso, just as though it were an arm. While this may be problematic, which we will get into later as losing legs on a quad is very much an issue, when in partial cover, its forelimbs, even though they are stand-ins for arms, benefit from partial cover in the same way normal legs do. So that does mean all 4 legs on a quad benefit from partial cover, which is very much important, as this can drastically reduce incoming fire for a quad mech in a hull-down position. Quads with all 4 legs being fully functional also can enter into a prone position, meaning they can be lowered to the ground and can fire without penalty for doing so. Quads have several advantages as far as their legs are concerned beyond this. First of all, they can advance on a diagonal without having to turn the mech in the direction first. Quads also have the ability to kick backwards. This is popularly referred to as mule kicking, by the way, and it is helpful when being flanked by enemy mechs, though this is done with a +1 modifier compared to a normal kick. Another big advantage is that quad mechs, while all their legs are operational as normal once again, get a -2 to all piloting skill rolls, making them incredibly stable. And they can stand if knocked down without making a piloting skill roll. But where do things go wrong, you may ask? Well, this is Battletech, and mechs will take damage and will degrade over a battle. Often, bipeds will lose arms, and side torsos in a lot of engagements, and must persist despite these problems. The real issue quads have, in my view, is how they degrade. The loss of a leg, even to a quad mech, is a disaster. A single leg being destroyed removes all PSR bonuses the mech once had. Even to stand now requires a PSR, and with no benefit. Its ability to fire without penalty when prone vanishes. Also, just like any other mech, if it loses a single leg, it will collapse as soon as it happens. These also have the benefit of losing 1 movement point upon the loss of the limb. To have a second leg removed is a doomed fate for the mech, as it will act as if it were a biped that is also missing a leg. In other words, the mech falls over, and it only has 1 movement point now, as well as additional penalties to skill rolls. When combined with the inability to torso twist inherently, barring having a specific quirk, and lacking arms, these benefits quickly start appearing as drawbacks. In battle, the best thing a quad mech can hope for is to be fighting from a hull-down position, and to be hoping that it cannot be outflanked by enemy assets, who will shred their legs. Now, with all of that out of the way, let us continue on our waltz through the history of these machines. How does a manufacturer become relevant in the expanse of space in Battletech? Hollis Industries figured it out in the mid-26th century, which was to deliberately thrust their organization into the world of Battlemechs. Another corporation sought to follow the same example, A company that went on to create a pair of the most underwhelming flops, lemons, if you will, of their age. The Brigadier Corporation. Now, one may ask, what was their reasoning for this? Why would the company head down a path of such folly, and seemingly willingly no less? Well, allow me to paint the picture for you, my friends. Brigadier, near the end of the Age of War, on the cusp of the new Star League era, was already involved with Battlemech and parts production, though they possessed no designs of their own. This meant that their company and its industrial output weren't receiving optimal returns, as they were more or less contractors filling in backlogs for parts or work on Battlemechs as needed. The real money, as with real life ironically, came from owning the technologies or designs associated with production. That was where the real profit in all of this was, and Brigadier had apparently earned a war chest to throw itself into this lucrative endeavor. That was, of course, provided that they had the right talent to do it. The catapult had put Hollis Industries on the map, and as the company began to face financial troubles, their talents were indeed almost free agents. Well, if you need to pave the way for a successful Battlemech launch, experienced persons are a very valuable commodity. Brigadier, wanting that very thing for themselves, thusly extracted one Dr. David Harrison from his contract with Hollis Industries, otherwise also known as Hollis Incorporated. I'm sure they could only see dollar signs ahead. This was an expert mech designer, and while his last project was a dud, that clearly had more to do with Hollis than it had to do with this genius amongst mech designers, of course. So, upon taking this man into their employment, they gave him once more what he'd craved before, a free hand. There were no more bureaucratic restraints, or a willingness to satisfy boards with half-finished products. No, he was given a team and the imperative to put Brigadier on the map with an exciting new Battlemech that would wow the world. Most assuredly, Brigadier would be the Defiance Industries or EarTech of its time. So, many of you may be wondering, why have I not heard of Brigadier more? Why do they not have a more prominent role in the setting? Where are their grand designs? Perhaps these questions are best left answered by simply following what their newest acquisition did, and how their plan unfolded. Dr. David Harrison, now given a free hand, with a new team, as well as with significant resources and great experience from his time at Hollis Industries, knew his mission goal, and knew what he had to do to cement his legacy for all time, as well as to bring vast wealth to his benefactors. What emerged from this genius of a mind, and from years of toiling with his new team? A brand new medium Battlemech was conceived, one which took into account the shortcomings of the Xanthos, and what is perhaps the most recognizable quad Battlemech of the Star League and Succession Wars. The ever-disappointing, apologies, I meant to say the underappreciated Scorpion. First built in 2570, the very year the Star League emerged, the Scorpion was intended to hit the ground running for Brigadier. Indeed, internally, the company praised Dr. Harrison for his work, offering him a job well done, if you will. He had finally taken his quad technologies from their infancy into a mature technology that did exactly what it promised on the package. In fact, Harrison was bold enough to claim that the Scorpion would change mech combat forever. And this was something Brigadier itself clearly believed as well. Perhaps it was accepted as truth, because it, and by extension its executives, had to believe. The company immediately got to work doing its job, now that Harrison had delivered, getting this mech into the hands of prospective buyers. That was apparently the sticking point, though. Not many prospective buyers in the great houses, and eventually the SLDF, really cared. Yes, there were some sales, but nothing near what Brigadier had hoped for. In fact, outside of their own backpatting of Dr. Harrison's work, There was little fanfare or praise for the Scorpion at all. It was almost as if it wasn't viewed in a positive light for some reason. The Quadmech was indeed the stable firing platform that Harrison had promised, outside of it apparently being a bumpy ride while it walked, for the pilot, that is. The machine was fast and mobile but lacked serious weaponry, and was very poorly defended against incoming fire for a 55-ton chassis. Once these mechs came into the field and their bugs were discovered by pilots, many would dump their mech's SRM ammo, or fire their launchers until the weapon was bled dry, for fear of its infamously likely to cook off payload coming alive inside the mech in the case of a critical hit. The mech earned a reputation for being hard to pilot, and being a death trap as a result, further hurting its sales with time. Now, one would assume that Brigadier would begin to get cold feet at this point. Dr. Harrison's vision for Battlemechs, though compelling to some clearly, just did not seem to be the font of innovation and acceptance that the militaries of the Inner Sphere appeared to be interested in. They were either too outside of the frame of understanding for potential buyers, or they didn't fit their military doctrines, or worst of all, bipedal mechs simply outcompeted them in battlefield effectiveness, dispelling the premise around them. However, with the Scorpion barely justifying its existence, and having some revenue from the supposed would-be titan of the industry, Brigadier decided, in all of its wisdom, to once more enable Dr. Harrison to expand his vision yet further. Evidently intent on throwing money away in large quantities, he set forth on his next four-legged project, the Goliath. Returning to the assault mech chassis type, this time Dr. Harrison was sure he'd learned all of the problems presented by both the Xanthos and the Scorpion. This time, his quadmechs would get it right, and change the very nature of warfare. Real quadmechs, in the mind of Dr. Harrison, ironically the creator of the quadmech as a whole, simply hadn't been tried up until this point, apparently. This new design solved many of the quality of life problems both the Xanthos and Scorpion possessed, and Brigadier, in its own estimation, had an excellent product on their hands as a result. Where the Scorpion was difficult to pilot, the Goliath was as smooth a ride as any biped. Where the Xanthos had serious performance issues, the Goliath could get up to speed and engage enemies as needed, without sluggishness. The problem was, for the newest creation of Dr. Harrison that is, after the wholesale disaster of the Xanthos trials, and the extremely questionable outing and performance of the Scorpion, the Goliath appeared before the Star League's Purchasing and Review Committee, and was met with exasperation and disinterest. They tried, most definitely Brigadier and Dr. Harrison did try to get their perfected quad off the ground, but the SLDF was having none of it. They passed over the mech without a second thought. Some house armies would find interest in the four-legged tank though, as well as some periphery powers. The Goliath's service there was acceptable enough that the SLDF did reach out to procure a small number of them, maybe even opening the door to what the now deceased Dr. Harrison had dreamt of. But the deal fell through with the Ameris coup. By the time of the Succession Wars, the Goliath was barely left in service with any power. Even for the Scorpion, many of them by the 31st century were being broken down for spare parts, putting both mechs near extinction. During the launch of the Goliath, it should be important to note, Hollis Industries, the first company seemingly foolish enough to embark on quad machines, attempted to crawl out of the mud. Seeing the attempts by Brigadier, and procuring some of the design alterations and technologies that allowed for the mech to be functional, and implementing them into their very poorly received Xanthos, which resulted in the XNT-30 Xanthos. Some of these new machines were sold to the Capellan Confederation, before Hollis Industries asked for bankruptcy protection, with them restructuring into a much more limited form, until their eventual success with a new machine. A biped, no less. The legendary Battlemaster. A medium mech weighing in at 55 tons, the SCP-1N Scorpion was the second attempt by Dr. David Harrison to bring his quad Battlemech vision to life. While it is considered a failure in its initially marketed form, the mech still does have some virtues, more precisely when taking into account its unique features, though these are heavily offset by its disadvantages. First appearing in 2570, it never became the hit that Brigadier or Harrison wanted. Still, examining its features, we can assess its overall performance here. To start with, it has a standard gyro, cockpit, and internal structure, as it was built with introductory, standardized pre-Star League technologies. When it comes to cooling, this quad also has the misfortune of only having 10 base heat sinks. To clarify why that is an issue, its primary cannon will overheat the mech if it moves and fires, and especially if it uses its secondary armament. For onboard electronics, the SCP-1N has a Garrett 500A communications package and a Garrett GRND-TRK-9 targeting and tracking system, neither of which confer it any bonuses. In the advanced rules, the Scorpion is saddled with the unfortunate hard-to-pilot trait, helping reduce some of its viability as a quad, and it has its rightly earned bad reputation trait. The real advantage of any quad comes in its movement category. This is because of the nature of their locomotion, allowing them to make moves on a diagonal without turning the facing of the mech. This can be incredibly helpful in multiple conditions. The Scorpion, being the first adopted quad, displays this attribute in an incredible way, because its investments in mobility are potentially amplified, except for when the quad needs to turn to meet adversaries at close ranges. This means it's much easier for the Scorpion, when it's on the move, to acquire movement bonuses for defense, or to even get into partial cover defensive positions that will help reduce the likelihood of absorbing incoming fire. In other words, it might move at the same speed as other mediums, but it is likely going to cover more ground. However, we are obviously getting ahead of ourselves. By what means does the Scorpion actually achieve this tactical superiority? Well, it is done with a 24.5-ton Vox 330 Fusion Standard engine, which gives it a maximum speed of 97 km per hour or 9 movement points in the tabletop game. The problem that this engine brings is it takes up almost half the mech's weight, severely limiting the Scorpion in almost every other respect. And what does that mean? It means that when we look at the armor triangle, the SCP-1N gets good points for mobility, but at a severe cost. And when playing this with the advanced rules, that mobility is further tempered by its poor quirks in some small ways. In other words, its ability to traverse ground needs to pay off for it, due to the size and tonnage placed into this particular category. I was almost tempted to not name this defense, and instead name this brief section Disaster. The Scorpion is guarded by 7 tons of Star Slab 4 armor, otherwise known as standard plating, giving it a total of 112 points of protection on the chassis. This is more what one would expect to see on a mech 15 tons lighter than the Scorpion. And that's another way of me saying it is poorly guarded. What's worse is that the armor must protect its legs as well, the most vital part of the machine. It has a total of 10 points of armor per leg. 2 medium laser hits or a single AC-10 strike will strip its very vital limbs of all that protects them. Flanking and striking at one side of the Scorpion will quickly yield results too, as its poor defenses, even for its torso, are stripped away, and the mech degrades in quick order. Its left torso is also occupied with ammunition, and not much else, making the mech even more likely to simply explode upon taking incoming fire. So to break it down, its legs are frail, and its torso is explosive. It is a complete disaster when it comes to its defenses, and it's entirely dependent on partial cover and mobility to keep itself safe. On another fun note, partial cover may reduce incoming hits, but its torso is hardly robust, meaning it cannot even persist long when it receives this advantage. When it comes to survivability, the Scorpion is most definitely worthy of its poor reputation. So with a lack of heat sinks and armored protection, surely it must be heavily gunned. Well, not particularly. The Scorpion in its base form isn't poorly armed in comparison to its closest contemporaries during the Succession Wars, such as the Shadowhawk, Base Wolverine, and Griffin, but it still most definitely feels inadequate, and there are a series of reasons why. Its Anderson Armaments Particle Projection Cannon, PPC-12, is a decent heavy weapon for its time, but absorbs the mech's entire heat budget before moving. Effectively, what this entails is that it may be restricted on firing every turn, even if the mech isn't partaking in close quarters engagements with its secondary weapon. This is without question an issue. Still, the weapon can punch holes, and that is valuable in a vacuum, or when it's not going to put the mech itself into heat jeopardy. The second and only other weapon system is its SRM-6 with 1 ton of ammunition. This will overwhelm the mech's thermal limits if fired with its PPC while the mech is on the move, which will have immediate negative effects. But the benefit of the SRMs is they do add scatter damage. Overall, the two systems would complement one another if the mech could cool down at all. Its engine deprives the mech of too many features, including things like heat sinks and armor. It cannot bring its weapons to bear effectively, and therefore ends up in the role of a sniper, trying to position itself in favorable terrain and firing, and hoping to be neither flanked or noticed. The Scorpion, for what it is not a good Battlemech. Even the benefits of being a quad can often be a curse, more than a benefit. It is lightly armored, lightly armed, and has poorly regulated thermals. This doesn't change the fact that it can be useful, as almost any mech can be, if used under a narrow set of circumstances. The painful truth is, though, its weaknesses are many. From exposed and easily struck ammunition, to poorly guarded legs, to being entirely dependent on terrain to be effective in battle, it really does struggle. Now, its movement and unique method of locomotion do give it advantages when moving in the open field, and it can benefit greatly from partial cover. But these advantages are just heavily outdone by the legion of problems, and the depth of issues faced by the Scorpion. Overall, the first adopted quad was a disaster when it was brought into the Inner Sphere, and continued to be one for centuries, until much later designers tried to tackle it with new technologies and major alterations. The youngest of the original 3 Harrison designs, the 80-ton Goliath stands apart from its siblings in that it has the least immediate issues with its core components. With a track record that was strong enough to almost be adopted by the SLDF before the collapse of the Star League, it really does stand apart from its peers, if only by a little. First of all, Brigadier used introductory technologies for the GOL-1H's core design, meaning it has a standard gyro, cockpit, and internal structure. When it comes to cooling, real consideration was put into this, and the Goliath as a result has a meaningful 17 total heat sinks on board, letting it dump a significant amount of its heat load every turn. As far as electronics are concerned, it comes with the Saurian Transband J9 communications package, as well as the Saurian B-Tech targeting and tracking system. The latter of these provides the Goliath with a quirk in the advanced rules, namely the multi-track feature. This amounts to it more easily diversifying its fire when playing with the optional rules. Additionally, it has exposed actuators. The Goliath, seeking to embrace its quad attributes, does come with a hefty engine on board for its size, namely a 22.5-ton Hermes 320 standard fusion engine, giving it a maximum speed of 64 km per hour or 6 movement points in the tabletop game. This is more than adequate for a mech between 60 to 85 tons, and with the benefits of it needing to turn less often, if on the move and fighting, the Goliath can more easily benefit from gaining movement bonuses. But this mobility would be in many instances truthfully used to get the Goliath into position, just due to the nature of its armaments. It is not an open-field fighter, skirmishing with others, and ideally it would like to be hull down and sniping targets. Its movement profile does help it achieve this, especially if there are disruptions to the battlefield. Unlike the Scorpion, the GOL-1H is extremely well protected for the era of its deployment. While it doesn't have advanced technologies like Case or Case 2, or specialist armor, it does have sheer mass to keep it safe. That is because it has an enormous 14.5 tons of Star Slab 3 standard plating, giving it a monstrous 232 points of armor for its enemies to chew through. Its rear legs have 30 points each, and its forelegs have 24, meaning multiple strikes from impressive weaponry would be needed to knock this thing off its feet. Even if its side torsos are well guarded, to fell this elephant of a Battlemech requires concentrated, well-placed fire. Though as a side note, if the left or even center torso is penetrated, much like the Scorpion, it is functionally a gigantic bomb. But when hull down, it is a nightmare to destroy if you cannot outflank it. For its time, the Goliath is relatively well armed for a light assault mech. When compared to nearby mechs like the Zeus, Marauder, or Battlemaster, its overall offensive package is on par with these respectable designs. Something that's important to remember, however, is that Introtech mechs can often get railroaded into very narrow niches because of primitive weaponry and tonnage restrictions. The Goliath is a long-range, direct-fire support mech. That is its job. If it is taken out of its element and engaged at 5 hexes or less, it will rapidly find itself in trouble. So to examine why that is the case, let us begin by going over its weaponry. It comes armed with a Rand PPC on the right torso, giving it long-range punching power. Backing this up are a pair of Holly long-range missile 10 racks, or LRM-10s, with 2 tons of ammunition, giving it the ability to fire indirectly or support the main cannon with scatter damage attacks. These weapons work great together, as you can guess, so long as its opposition can't close with it. In the role of fire support, the Goliath will deliver. For close quarters battles against lighter targets, it has a pair of machine guns, which is frankly not very much, but it does make it able to handle infantry should they try to get involved with the 1H. Overall, its offense is solid, but as mentioned, it has a real weakness in that if its enemies can slip past its LRMs, it really only has a PPC. And for an assault mech, that's not really all that much. It is a sniper, not a brawler. Easily the best performing quad of the original pair from TRO 3025, the Goliath has its virtues when employed as it was designed. Its mobility will help get it into place, and from a solid firing position, it can deliver powerful strikes on opposing forces. Where things fall apart is if your opponent doesn't let the machine operate as intended. Despite its heavy armor, it is not impervious, especially on the left side. When it is penetrated, its machine gun ammunition can be struck. Close-range fighting, barring its mighty kicks, is still a dangerous play for the 1H as well. Overall, the Goliath is a solid mech, but not one without its shortcomings, as is the case with almost all machines. Only ever purchased by the Capellan Confederation as far as major buyers, and barely crawling into the Second Succession War before functionally going extinct within the Inner Sphere, the XNT-30 was the continuation of the XNT-20, though with updates to make the mech at least somewhat serviceable. Once more using Introtech components, the XNT-30 comes with a basic gyro, cockpit, and internal structure. When trying to keep the mech out of the sun, as far as heat is concerned, it has an enormous number of single heat sinks installed, giving it a total of 23 thermal capacity per turn. It takes up a lot of tonnage, but it does let the mech fire a lot of weapons for its time. The electronics on board are the Hartford Co. COM 2500 communications package, as well as the Hartford Co. XKX2 targeting and tracking system. The only real quirk this variant of the Xanthos has moving forward is improved life support. which is odd given its reputation in universe is still quite lackluster. Unlike the other quads discussed so far, barring the original Xanthos, the XNT-30 is not quick on its feet, and will not be repositioning with much frequency or ease. Even with the lack of needing to turn frequently, it is slow. And being slow is most definitely a drawback for a quad mech, as they lack arms, and they lack the ability to torso twist. This is a major liability, potentially, for the Xanthos. Being powered by a 19-ton VLAR 300 standard fusion engine, the Xanthos once more has a running speed of just 54 km per hour or 5 movement points in the tabletop game. This means it really will struggle to generate defensive movement bonuses, even with the benefits of not needing to turn as often. Its maneuverability and speed also can't, in any way, stop it from being flanked, which is, in a word, problematic. Mobility determines what sort of role a mech will have, and in this instance, the Xanthos is essentially a battering ram, a breakthrough mech. But can it actually perform that role? The most armored hull in the game using pre-hardened armor, the XNT-30 is extremely heavily protected, and to be honest, it needs to be, because its weaponry will force this on it. It is guarded by 20.5 tons of Duralex heavy plating, giving it 323 points of armor, surpassing even the mighty Atlas in this respect. Each of its huge legs has 42 points of armor, making them agonizing to chew through. The weakest point on the mech is its side torsos, which still have a respectable 32 points per side. Just grinding this mech down will, in and of itself, be difficult. Where its main weakness is not in its protection, but in how the mech is forced to be used. So, to understand why the XNT-30 might be problematic, you need to understand one of the primary weaknesses of quad Battlemechs, which are their firing arcs. Without the ability to torso twist and without arms, they can almost never fire into their side arcs. This means that almost all quads are directional cannons, not dissimilar to assault guns from the early 20th century. Some can be fitted with turrets, or may have extended torso twist abilities in the advanced rules, but by and large, this impacts most quads. Now, fast-moving four-legged mechs can get around this somewhat in active engagements rather than hull-down fighting, but it is the greatest weakness of all quads in close-quarters fighting or brawling. So, if you build your quad mech, which is also really slow I might add, for close-quarters engagements, you're gonna have a bad time. The Xanthos 30, as you've probably already guessed, does in fact fall into this trap. Let me demonstrate as to why, by showing you its armaments. It is armed with a GE-508 Class 20 autocannon, 3 Martel medium lasers, and a Holly short-range missile Pack-6, all for close-range fighting. It has 15 rounds of fire for its AC-20, spread across its right and left torso, and it has 15 rounds of SRM ammunition found in the left torso, meaning that both side torsos have ammunition vulnerabilities, and no case, because it's too early for that. These weapons are all short-range systems. Once more, the left torso seems to have the majority of the ammunition, and therefore the majority of the bang. I have just explained why this is not an optimal setup for the mech, especially given how it only moves at 54 km per hour. It does have a rear-firing small laser, like a giant salamander that farts, and it also has a Donnell particle projection cannon to try to harass or punch holes into targets at long range. This mech is nearly useless at long-range hull-down fighting, as it only has one weapon for it, and it can barely reposition. If it tries to be hull down for close-range fighting, it will in all likelihood be engaged at range, or worse, it will be flanked with ease, or perhaps it will even get kicked in the head. On paper, it is fearsome. In real tactical engagements, however, because of its lack of versatility and lack of range, its weaponry will rarely deliver, because it will only have the option to use most of them if your enemy lets you. Plodding and slow, the Xanthos is only superior to the original in its lack of bad quirks, and its much heavier armor. The truth is, it is a battering ram and little else. It is wholly dependent on its lance escorting it up the field, and hoping it can be used to knock out enemies at close range, who choose more often than not to get in the way of its guns. It is still Hollis Industries' greatest folly, and it is the true-to-form example as to why quads cannot be the revolutionary next generation of Battlemechs that Dr. Harrison dreamt of. Its flaws, partially coming from its very body plan, and they are too great to be ignored. In the midst of the Star League's rule, during one of the most prosperous centuries, the 27th century to be more specific, quad battlemechs were hardly in frequent use. The Scorpion was a disappointment and was scattered across the inner sphere. The Xanthos was a disaster that was only employed by the Capellan Confederation armed forces, and the Goliath was a rarity only seen sparingly in house militaries and in the periphery. Dr. David Harrison's dreams of changing the face of warfare were in a coma, or perhaps even dead by this moment in time. But, clearly, there were successors to the good, well, mediocre Doctor. His intellectual descendants at Brigadier Corporation on Oliver believed they could redefine mech warfare just as he had, only with yet more ambition. To give context to all of this, during this century a new form of battlemech was generating interest at a high level. These were called LAMs. A LAM, or Land Air Mech, is a vehicle which can take on three forms. One, that of a regular battlemech. Another, they take on the form of an aerospace fighter. And finally, they could appear as a halfway point between the two, what's called air mech mode. These were, at first, considered to not only be cutting edge, but they were also considered some of the most precious fighting machines available. Though they failed in many respects, they were highly prized for their ability to strike into their enemy's rear. This said nothing, too, of their value as scouts. These became functionally Special Forces mechs. They would eventually lose favor for a multitude of reasons, even in the Star League, but during the 27th century they were still seen as extremely viable. So, how was it that Brigadier and its scientists intended to redefine mech warfare this time? Certainly it couldn't just be to take the concept of the LAM and marry it to quad battlemechs in one of the most bizarre and unhelpful combinations in history. That couldn't be it at all. Oh, good God. That was their idea. In the late 27th century, sadly, Brigadier, in an attempt to combine their know-how with quad mechs, and in an attempt to compete for the extravagant contracts offered by the SLDF, did indeed make a bold attempt to combine LAM technology with their quad chassis. What is amusing is, briefly, there appears to have been hope, even if it was shot down almost immediately, that they could use the Goliath for this project. With that being totally impossible, just due to how LAM technology works, they opted to retrofit the 55-ton Scorpion into a land air mech, known as the Scorpion LAM. Apparently unintimidated by the challenge put before them, the design team at the company set forth with the task, almost eagerly. With engine modifications, through downsizing it to be clear, it was in theory possible to add the necessary components that would allow this mech to transform into an aerospace platform. In fact, they became so confident in this, they actually didn't just believe they could make this mech happen, they believed that the Scorpion's reputation itself would be rescued by this evolution, and given a new lease on life. I'm serious, by the way, they actually believed this. To the developers, they saw its already flat chassis as something that they could more easily adapt, and believed it'd give the mech an edge over its competitors. More or less, they knew that its flat body might add more surface area for lift and aerodynamics. The sides of the mech were also unused in the original chassis, allowing for the addition of expanding winglets on the side, which were hopefully going to add stability to the frame as it transformed and took off into the air. The forelegs were meant to fold partially in during hybrid mode, and locked into the chassis' underbelly once it entered fighter mode. The real problem was that the actual core torso, the main body of the mech, needed to be reshaped per transformation. This was considered to be a fixable issue, and once it was resolved, the flexibility of the mech would drastically improve, and it'd even potentially solve some of the mech's piloting issues. It was hoped that these changes would even help the mech discard its long and unfortunate reputation. All of these design changes happened in lab conditions, however. Outside of the lab, when put into the real-world conditions in the testing range, this four-legged lamb proved entirely incapable of achieving a transformation from land to hybrid or to aerospace mode. The quad entirely collapsed into the dirt on every attempt. After multiple failures to achieve the desired result, they opted for a new approach, at least to prove some progress had been made. They sent the mech out in air mech mode, where it was demonstrated to have the ability, barely, to transform into Battlemech mode on the field. It did so, notably, without grace. Having deluded themselves into believing that this was some kind of substitute for being able to transform from mech mode into any other stage, the team and company believed they had scented success, and so opted to press on further with the design. The key problem with pressing forward was, the propulsion on board simply couldn't generate enough lift to make the mech operate correctly. It couldn't lift off the ground when transforming into air mech mode. It also couldn't generate enough thrust to fly properly in fighter mode. The team was so stubborn and, frankly, reckless, that just to prove that it could work, they dragged this mech into the sky with a shuttle and dropped it from the edge of space towards the planet below. The objective of this? To prove that the mech had the possibility, under even the most narrow of circumstances, to achieve powered flight. Instead of mastering anything resembling flight, the fighter mode variation of the LAM only managed something approaching a controlled descent, before the test pilot lost faith in the craft and ejected at 300 meters above the ground. The Scorpion LAM would go on to crash into a rocky outcropping on the test field site. I do not believe it was retrievable from this. After this debacle, Brigadier finally had enough. Not because of the repeated, embarrassing failures, mind you, no. Brigadier finally ran out of money, much as Hollis had generations prior, when they saddled themselves with some of Dr. Harrison's eccentric ideas. The project had cost so much money that it nearly drowned the company. The losses were extensive and could not be sustained any longer. The entire team was unceremoniously fired for their efforts. Funnily enough, all of this, though, showed that in Battlemech mode, this variation of the Scorpion actually outperformed the original in its overall performance and quality. It just never ended up being adopted into a refit version of the design, as Brigadier had simply spent so much money on the failed venture that they no longer had the resources to do so, leaving the original Scorpion without any of the benefits that had been discovered when making the new version of it. Perfect. This is peak quad mech development. Shockingly and sadly, this was not even the final attempt at doing this. Prior to the Blakist era, it was discovered that Defiance Industries, during the Succession Wars, made multiple secret attempts at the same project. Even with more advanced technologies and vastly more resources, and even multiple attempts, this House Steiner contractor utterly failed to achieve a workable quad LAM either. Apparently the siren's call of a four-legged mech that can transform into a jet is just incredibly strong, and attracted moneyed interests across time into squandering immense amounts of resources. It is both bizarre, yet somehow entirely unsurprising. Its oddness is only matched by how disappointing the machine itself ended up being. A LAM-based Battlemech weighing in at 55 tons, the failed venture of the Scorpion LAM is truly one of the most bizarre machines to appear during the Star League era. It is nearly identical to the original design, too. Its chassis, cockpit, armor, and weaponry remain unchanged. What changes is, of course, the addition of LAM conversion equipment, as well as shrinking the engine to a 275 standard fusion, and the addition of jump jets. Beyond this, it's really a basic Scorpion, for all of its faults, except it moves 10 km per hour slower. Let's go over its advanced rules before moving on, as they are delightful. It has hard to pilot, illegal design, non-functional, referring to its conversion system to be clear, obsolete 2692, and prototype. Its advanced rules are, in other words, as disastrous as the mech and the concept. Congratulations to Brigadier and Defiance. You played yourselves. A time of resurgence, of pushing against the darkness brought on by stagnation and decline. The 31st century became an era of terrible conflict, but also one of advancement and achievement. After the discovery of the Helm Memory Core, and with the redevelopment of infrastructure, and factories bringing online once-lost technologies and know-how, military and civilian products grew spectacularly more sophisticated and widespread. This impacted ancient war machines, which had been in service in the Inner Sphere for centuries. Some could now be restored to their original grandeur, while others were given refits based on now more readily available components. The quad Battlemechs of the day, more or less the only remaining two, the Scorpion and the Goliath, also received packages that were mostly very simple during this first wave of upgrades, many of which just appeared as the clans began their invasion. The Goliath obtained an XL engine and replaced its PPC with a Gauss rifle, further entrenching it in its original role, though with some vulnerability placed into it. The Scorpion, however, received an abomination of an upgrade. While yes, it was errated sometime later, I choose to acknowledge its original form instead. All it did was upgrade its PPC to an ER PPC. This meant that when it fired its main cannon, it immediately overheated by 5. Amazing engineering on display, everyone. It now has double heat sinks. But for those who were there for it, it is impossible to forget the original configuration. By contrast to the Scorpion being a disaster, which is just the Scorpion in general, the performance of the Goliath 3M at this time, with its mighty Gauss rifle, did indeed have an impact beyond its ability to help repel the clan invasion. It gave confidence, in this case to one of its manufacturers, Saurian Enterprises, to do something which had not been done since the middling response of the Scorpion and the Goliath. Learning lessons from the past, and seeing potential for the future, Saurian began the process of designing a brand new light Battlemech. A brand new light quad Battlemech, to be more accurate. The ZPH-1 Tarantula emerged 2 years after the ceasefire established by the Battle of Tukiad, and was an exceptional machine for its era, even if an imperfect one. Conceived for a recon mission role, its mobility on the battlefield is almost unmatched, as it combined a reasonable quad mech design in a reasonable battlefield role with advanced Star League era technologies. With its stability, speed, and agility, it can scout targets and evade pursuers with incredible grace. In field tests and trials, many pilots noted their preference for the machine over venerable go-to mechs like the Spider. Still, the quad mech was met with skepticism. Quad mechs had terrible reputations, even with the Goliath being somewhat of an exception. The stink of the Scorpion too lingered on fast-moving mechs with a four-legged profile. So immediate was the revulsion by many commanders that they outright asked to not be assigned the mech, which upon its introduction led to a policy by many of the house armies who bought it to make utilizing it per formation voluntary. To combat these issues, Saurian created a comprehensive marketing campaign. It went as far as to include volunteers, promotional holovids for distribution to potential buyers and appropriate independent units, as well as battlefield footage with the vehicle, and even taking things a step further with Mechwarrior testimonials. Just to get their foot in the door to create hype around the mech and its performance, a number of these mechs were even just directly donated to various units, just to try and allow word of mouth to develop organically. During its premiere in the 3050s, however, this didn't give the desired results, at least not right away. Only in the 3060s, with the great resurgence of four-legged mechs appearing, did the machine begin to find true and meaningful success. Though, the Tarantula itself would have an impact far greater than one might imagine, as even the clans took note of it. A light mech weighing in at 25 tons. The Tarantula, first built in 3054, is a fast-moving, agile recon battlemech and potential light mech hunter as well. Using advanced inner-sphere technologies for the time, Saurian Enterprises, the manufacturer, made the absolute most they could of this little devil. To start off with, it has a standard gyro, cockpit, and internal structure due to the era of its development and because they opted for other weight-saving technologies instead of endo steel. For keeping the mech from melting down, it uses the default level of double heat sinks, letting it dump 20 heat per turn, which is easily more than enough for this mech to run cool. As far as electronics are concerned, it has a Garrett T10B communications package as well as a Saurian Calcmaster targeting and tracking system. When using the advanced rules, the Tarantula in fact has several key advantages. First, it has the easy to pilot trait, giving it an edge in handling. More importantly, it has the extended torso twist feature, which means unlike other quads, when using the advanced rules, the ZPH series can twist and fire just like a biped, which is incredibly powerful for a quad battlemech. Finally, it has exposed actuators, because nothing in life is perfect. Mobility is the Tarantula's greatest strength. Not only does it benefit from the advantages of being a quad, but Saurian leaned into this heavily, and only further enhanced this attribute. Being powered by a 4.5-ton Nissan 200 Extra Light Fusion engine, the ZPH-1 can accelerate to a maximum speed of 130 km per hour, or 12 movement points in the tabletop game. There is no doubt about this. This is extremely impressive, and when factoring in it will often not need to change its facing, it makes it very probable that the mech can achieve significant movement bonuses, or use terrain to its advantage. Better yet, it also has the ability to jump up to 240 meters, or 8 movement points. This is spectacular and only further adds to its exceptional movement profile. Leaping can be used in the life or death moments of brawling, or it can be used to navigate through difficult terrain features. Most importantly, it can acquire major defensive bonuses, once more from this method of movement. Overall, the Tarantula is a ruthlessly effective speedster, and an agile one at that. Even bipeds that move faster might not be able to outdo it. Well, it can't be perfect. Being a mech that only weighs in at 25 tons, the Tarantula is genuinely fragile. It's not particularly frail for its weight, but 25-ton mechs in general are just not going to be particularly durable. So, it has 4.5 tons of standard armor, giving it 72 points of protection. Its legs are definitely fragile, with only 7 points of outer armor protecting each one. However, this is a light mech, and it is a very fast one. It will be easy for it to get partial cover, or to gain defensive bonuses. Still, if it takes any significant fire, it will fall apart quick. As a recon asset, the Tarantula is not armed like the Commando or Javelin, though it is not totally hopeless. For its primary weapons, it has a pair of Magnum Mark II medium lasers, and for a backup, a Streak SRM-2 with 1 ton of ammunition. This is far from impressive, but again, it's a 25-ton mech that jumps 8 hexes. The wait to have a deadly arsenal was spent on making it jump. That mobility in its own way is a weapon, and not one that should be ignored. You can be back attacked by the Tarantula. It is very much possible. Remember, being attacked from behind in Battletech is never really ignorable. The Tarantula is a spectacular scout mech. Its grace lends it to the role in a way that almost no other machine can match. Even with more advanced technologies. It's fast, 4-legged, and can jump a quarter of a kilometer in a single bound. Its weaponry isn't impressive, but it's still enough to backstab its enemies, or ward off fellow light mechs. Defense isn't its strong suit, but it's a 25-ton mech. Overall, the Tarantula is a fantastic machine for its intended role, and is, of the first quad mechs introduced to the game, one of the best. Throughout the 3060s, quad mechs underwent a revolution, truly. A multitude of brand new designs emerged across the inner sphere, joining ranks with the very sharp Tarantula. Machines like the Bishamon, Bargeist, Blue Flame, White Flame, and Sirocco began to appear at this time, making a significant impact to the general layout of Battlemech forces from this point forward. While not as world-changing as Dr. Harrison, Hollis Industries, and Brigadier Industries would have liked in the past, this was still a major upswing for the traditionally underutilized quad mechs. But changes were not only appearing within the successor states and the word of Blake regarding this formerly obscure technology, because after the clan invasion, and later after the counterattack by the Inner Sphere that destroyed Clan Smoke Jaguar, the clans themselves were given new insight into just how effective, or ineffective depending on their deployment, these 4-legged mechanical monstrosities could be. While a few had appeared in the past of the clans, like the Thunder Stallion and Fire Scorpion, these were, in clan society, as poorly received in many respects as the Scorpion and the Goliath in the Inner Sphere. Pilot preference always seemed to push against adopting quad mechs in almost every clan. Part of the reasons for this were the internal limitations on quads, which just did not have enough room to yield major upgrades on board. The lack of arms also meant a lack of storage capacity, and this said nothing of the fact that clans had a preference for dueling, not general combat. All of these complications really limited how they could even be designed. This changed, or at least started to change, after the capture and examination of the Tarantula. In Clan Cloud Cobra specifically, they opted to design and build their own quad. One heavily influenced by it, no less. While the machine at first seemed destined for the same fate as other quads, in either limited or no adoption, the machine's performance and the scientists' arguments influenced the Cobra's lore master, Eleni Reyes, to push the new design, resulting in its full production and adoption. The mech that was overall the product of this was the Stalking Spider, a very ambitious machine that looked as dangerous as it was. A simple, easy-to-manufacture medium mech with excellent mobility and reasonable firepower, it is a true evolution of the original line of quad mechs that first appeared centuries earlier, combining elements of the Scorpion and Tarantula seemingly. Its stability was what was most desired, as it matched their specific military doctrine, combining fire platforms, hot drops, and aerospace support. Even after the Wars of Revan, Where the homeworld clans opted to separate themselves wholly from the corrupting influences of the Inner Sphere, this machine was considered successful enough that it was succeeded within the sphere by the Stalking Spider too. There is certainly something to be said for a mech that had such a pragmatic design and draw that a sequel would be made, even by those unaffiliated with its original creators. A straightforward, vicious Clan 50-ton medium mech, the Stalking Spider is an agile predator that smartly uses Clan technologies while also reducing the limitations that quad mechs often have with internal components. First built by Clan Cloud Cobra and 3059, sadly, it has yet to appear in the Inner Sphere after the Blakist era, though its somewhat less effective successor design has. To start off with, it has a standard gyro, cockpit, and internal structure. Even with Clan tech, a quad can only fit so much in it, and the designers likely also wanted to keep its cost down. When looking at what the Stalking Spider does to keep cool, it uses Clan double heat sinks and possesses 11 of them, letting it dump 22 heat per turn. Now this won't allow it to alpha strike safely, but that's fine, as its weaponry is largely bracketed, and that will keep the mech cold running effectively when used in this way. As far as electronics are concerned, this Clan Spider has a Build 1700-1 Tacticom communications package, as well as a Series 32 multi-track targeting and tracking system. Neither of these confer the Stalking Spider any particular traits, however. Its only currently listed quirk in the advanced rules is the Stable attribute, which helps, but it's already a quad. Mobility is key for any quad, and the Stalking Spider is an agile and deadly predator, even if it is one that largely doesn't use sophisticated equipment to reach this outcome. To begin our journey through its movement profile, it comes with a 12.5-ton Mark 9 250 standard fusion power plant, letting it reach a maximum speed of 86 km per hour or 8 movement points in the tabletop game. This isn't where this particular aspect of speed ends, however, as it also has mask on board. When this feature is engaged, which can be very dangerous to be clear, as every time it is engaged there is a chance of failure that may cause damage to its legs, it will burst to speeds of over 100 km per hour and provide 10 movement points for a single turn at a time. This makes the mech deceptively fast for its weight and for its technology level. It also means that the machine doesn't suffer from the weaknesses of an XL engine either, keeping its durability high, so long as the mask isn't engaged too often, of course. After this, the Stalking Spider has an impressive 5 jump jets installed on board, letting it leap up to 150 meters in a single bound, providing it with 5 movement points, offering it even more options when engaging its prey, or letting it reposition to safer locations to strike out from. Overall, between the benefits of being a quad and its jump capabilities, the Stalking Spider is extremely capable in the department of agility. Protection is inherently higher on Clan Battlemechs as a whole. Not only do they just have more advanced materials to build their Battlemechs from, but their core frames have a standard case system built into them by default. So to begin with, the Stalking Spider's ammunition is much less likely to disable or destroy the mech from the onset, because it has a case by default, if that happens. Beyond this, this Spider has Clan-quality ferrofibrous plating, which not only takes up less critical space than Inner Sphere ferrofibrous, but also provides more protection per ton of the material. In this case, the mech is guarded by 8 tons of compound R5H5 ferrofibrous, conferring it 153 points of armor. This is nearly the equivalent of 10 tons of standard plating, which is very much acceptable for a 50-ton Battlemech. Between its mobility and armor, this can be quite the difficult piece to remove from the battlefield, but it must rely on these 2 segments together to truly be survivable. While it would be a lie to say that the Stalking Spider is heavily armed for a 50-ton clan mech, it is smartly armed for its tonnage and profile. It really has 2 primary means of attack. First, it has a Clan Tech ERPPC. This is a head-capping weapon, and one which the Spider can fire and jump at full distance with without overheating. This punches holes and potentially ends fights, It is excellent to harass and snipe with, especially when the Spider is hull down. When things come in close, and because of its jump jets, the Stalking Spider is not incompetent at brawling. The real vicious bite of this savage creature is put on display. It is armed with a pair of medium pulse lasers for accurate, vicious fire, and to fill damaged spaces and crit fish, it has a pair of SRM-4 missile launchers. Ideally, this mech will punch holes on the way in, and overwhelm its opponents in close with pulse lasers, jump jets, and missiles. It can be a threat to any mech at any range. Its offensive offerings are balanced and powerful. The Stalking Spider is a superb quad battlemech for a whole host of reasons. First, it's agile and mobile for its tonnage, and for its cost of production. Second, it's well guarded for its weight. And finally, it has weaponry to engage any target at any range. When pulling all of this information together, the mech is a surprisingly competent combatant at just about everything, making it a particularly vicious opponent to come across. When used in a formation, it can be a real nightmare to contend with, especially if it is unrestrained by the limitations of the clan's honor system, also known as Zelbriggen. Listen and understand. That Terminator is out there. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity, or remorse, or fear, and absolutely will not stop, ever, until you are dead. Kyle Reese, The Terminator, 1984. So far, we've examined the evolution of design, as it directly relates to the works of Dr. David Harrison and their linear successors. In other words, mechs that he helped put together, or were direct successors of those in some way. And for the most part in this esteemed video, that has been the path I wanted to take us down. There are, however, a multitude of other quads, many mentioned in passing earlier, where they didn't have quite as clear of a connection, or don't flow quite as easily from one point or another in the video, and they may find examination elsewhere in other videos I intend to produce. However, there was one development of quad technology that is very much a side road to all of this, but it is one I feel I have to mention. I want to talk about when this technology, quads, was grafted onto an abomination. The religious order of Comstar, his most blessed order, shattered after the Battle of Tukiad into those that followed the vision put forward by secularists, and those that held on to the traditions and beliefs that had guided Comstar for centuries. Demona Aziz was the first true leader for the faithful, but after her death, they would find a new master in the form of Thomas, the Master Merrick. To the secularists, those who often happen to be the least in the know, they believed that the word of Blake was in the minority of personnel upon the Great Schism. With the comm guards mostly on side, surely it would be they, the righteous restorers, that would inevitably prevail over those seemingly lost to dogma and religiosity. How wrong they were, and what a price humanity would pay for it. The word of Blake was in reality a vast organization. Elements coalesced together with time, including hidden worlds with ancient or freshly discovered technologies and advancements. The organization had far sharper knives than their adversaries had originally believed, in other words. Their presence expanded, their power and sophistication escalated, and when the Second Star League collapsed, they unleashed a literal hell upon the inner sphere and a violent conflagration of frustration and rage over their now ruined goals and dreams. If the prophecies, as Thomas Merrick understood them, were wrong, then that could not be. No, they would be the divine hand of fate themselves. Their actions saw billions perish. The inner sphere was torn asunder. Amongst the countless dead were remarkable soldiers and individuals, and it saw the inevitable downfall of Comstar in the long run too. However, it also displayed true horror. This came in the form of the legions of cyborgs who had been crafted and now marched under the word of Blake's banner. These abominations existed for war and were meant to be a halfway point towards a new tomorrow, a new dawn. Terra-driving machines were deployed mostly in shadow divisions, such as the celestial Battlemechs, which were true monstrosities to behold. But for all of their armies, for all of their technology, for all of their followers who were willing to give of themselves, it was never enough. As their empire eroded, as the last line of defense, strange new machines began to appear in the Sol system. Four-legged and light, they fought with reckless abandon. Despite their relatively average designs, what made these series of mechanized things so horrifying was their sheer numbers and their ruthless behavior. These creatures, as much as they were just machines, fought without much regard for tactics or survival. The most frequent of these was the Revenant. Some would call it unremarkable, but in truth its weaponry was perfect for smashing light mechs, vehicles, battle armor, and infantry formations. These predatory anathemas hunted across battlefields in the dark days of the final battles across the Sol system, and most notably, Terra. When they were first encountered, many assumed these four-legged mechs must have been piloted by crazed fanatics. But reports came in after some had been collected post-battle. They were empty vessels. They were as soulless as what the word of Blake had become through its internal purges and atrocities. Hordes of these devils would be encountered, taking their toll on the attackers. But it was too late for the word of Blake, who were vanquished from the inner sphere, at least for now. But the story of the Revenant did not end there. Like a ghost, many of the ideas of the word of Blake did not end with them. Perhaps their innovations in the realm of remotely operated or independently controlled Battlemechs will grow with time, as in their own state of desperation, in the dying days of the Republic of the Sphere, the Revenant would be restored, and was set to hunt the forces of the clans and the Capellan Confederation. But just as before, the Revenant could not save those who built it, this time. Looking at it from the broadest of views, back to the origins of this form of war machine, when Dr. Harrison envisioned quad Battlemechs, he viewed them as something that would inevitably change the very nature of warfare. He believed, with all sincerity, that the Xanthos, and later the Scorpion and Goliath, would prove to be so obviously the correct body plan for Battlemechs moving into the future, that they would become the default design with time. He couldn't have been more wrong. Even if after centuries and major revisions they would find some success, finally, on the battlefields of the inner sphere. His vision was a fantasy, and always would be one. But Comstar, through their celerity, and more importantly, the word of Blake, through the Revenant and other drone mechs, may have reshaped this dream into a nightmare. Human-powered quad Battlemechs have their role on the current battlefield, but will never be the primary Battlemechs deployed by any human army, but for an army crafted of monsters, guided by silicone processors, and enacting ruthless, heartless executions of their orders. An army guided by despots, dictators, masters, or even something more abominable. Perhaps the face of warfare finally will, in a twisted way, achieve Dr. Harrison's ideals, even if he himself would be revolted by them. Perhaps the future is of four-legged machines, simply not ones guided by human hands or human minds. They need only the technology, and maybe the peace of Blake. A light mech, well, a light mech of sorts, and one weighing in at 30 tons, the Revenant is not a traditional combat vehicle in the world of Battletech, as it is not operated by a human being. Semi-independent, while depending on orders from another source, though still lethal even when inhibited by electronic warfare, the Revenant and its less known and deployed siblings are some of the most dangerous things to ever emerge in Battletech, at least in their concept. Using advanced onboard core components, the Revenant is still smart with these acquisitions, keeping its costs from rising too sharply. First of all, it uses an endo-steel chassis, saving weight but at the cost of critical space. It does use a standard gyro, but it also has a 4.5-ton robotic cockpit on board, obviously removing its human pilot as a result. Despite lacking a living being as a pilot, the mech must still manage its temperature, but only can afford the bare minimum, so it was decided to give the mech 10 base double heat sinks, letting it cool 20 per turn. Under most conditions, it is adequate. For electronics, later models come with the Comstar Remote Link Theta Communications Module, as well as an IOTA Luminous TCKM targeting and tracking system. The original 1A Revenant's electronics were likely different. The model using this particular communications configuration, the UBM-2R, benefited from improved communications. The UBM-1A has, on the other hand, non-standard parts as an advanced rule and is classified as obsolete as of 3079. While the fact that the Revenant is operated by a machine in ways other Battlemechs are not, and this is in fact revolutionary, much of the rest of the mech isn't. And this is on purpose. Keeping it simple is a benefit, not a disadvantage, for a tool that was intended to overwhelm its opposition potentially with numbers. This means that its mobility, while not being ignored, does not use any complex engine types, or additional movement enhancements, like a supercharger or jump jets. Instead, it has a plain, standard 7-ton GM-180 standard fusion power plant that lets it move up to 96 km per hour, or 9 movement points in the tabletop game. A point of criticism noted for the machine in its own readout is that it isn't particularly fast by this era of combat for a light mech, but that doesn't take into account its quad attributes, which may work in its favor in this respect, at the very least providing it with the agility needed to generate frequent movement bonuses. Its vicious and fear-inducing legs skitter across the field as it hunts its prey. This is something that could be truly unsettling for its would-be victims, before they are descended upon. As an expendable machine, defense was not taken into consideration to an extremely high level, and this is unsurprising. It has no advanced defense features for the era, and comes only with standard plating to guard it. However, 6 tons of armor isn't wholly useless, and its 96 points of protection are distributed smartly, barring its lessened head armor. Still, survivable, the Revenant is not. But is that really an issue? Played down as if it is only a threat to light forces, in reality the Revenant is actually quite well armed for its tonnage, and can deliver damage at close range to mediums or even heavies if it is not disabled or destroyed quickly. Armed with twin ER medium lasers and twin medium pulse lasers, it can do a surprising amount of damage, and its pulse lasers are accurate, even though both sets of light projectors are only of inner sphere quality. These will deliver if the Revenant can get in range. Beyond that, it has 4 light machine guns and 200 rounds of ammunition for dispatching infantry or for crit fishing. Its weapons package is smartly designed for its weight and roll. Just don't expect it to win any long-range duels. The UBM-1A Revenant is a marvel of its age. Cheap and effective, it doesn't even rely on pilots to be a viable on-field asset. Whether it be an individual chaos-fed mad machine attempting to hunt unfriendly infantry, or it be firing pulse lasers into a light mech, or overwhelming a heavy formation as huge numbers of them pour over the landscape, it is an exceptional little devil for its value. The first true ground combat vehicle of its type, at least one that received broad-scale adoption, it is much more dangerous than you might imagine when employed correctly, as its 4 legs skitter across the battlefield, moving with a mechanical pace towards its victims. Competition of design does exist in Battletech, even if it may not be given fair exposure. Quad Battlemechs were not given nearly the resources their bipedal peers were when they were being developed. More or less, the biped Battlemechs of an earlier era had a head start, far more time to be refined, more opportunities to grow and change, and also ironically had time to become tried and tested. Dr. Harrison and the companies he worked for, trying to upset that balance, opted to challenge this. It was a bold plan, an innovative strategy, but it was one that they themselves were unable to achieve. The reason for their stumbling attempts' failure, quite honestly, it was the vision of their competing body plan in the first place. In a hypothetical world with more resources, more time, more options, and just different methods of warfare, perhaps even like the ones Dr. Harrison had envisioned with the Xanthos, these mechs would have been the true game changers they were intended to be. But this was not reality. It was a mirage in the Doctor's mind's eye. The bipedal Battlemech won the short-lived competition between the body plans, not just due to its superiority out of the gate, but through further development. Regardless of what one thinks, these machines are the norm, and will continue to be the norm, for Battlemech combat in the far-flung future of Battletech. Even when this competition reignited in the late 31st and early 32nd centuries, the bipeds still stand tall. But, much like with evolution, quads have excelled at niches overall. They make for superior scout mechs, as demonstrated by the Tarantula. They are also vicious when designed correctly, like the Stalking Spider. And they make for excellent sniper and support mechs, like the Goliath, or even other nimble, lighter machines. Where they lose is ironically in the role Dr. Harrison had originally wanted. Slow-moving, direct combat battlemechs, or even reasonably fast brawlers, will suffer severely on the battlefield. Now, into this new age of Battletech, bipeds do indeed continue to dominate. But in their shadow, these four-legged, almost mistakes of concept, have found their place beside them on the battlefields of the 32nd century. With new, powerful refits as well, even old designs, ones that were extinct, or on the cusp of extinction, have found a new lease on life in this new age of warfare. The truth must be told, Dr. David Harrison was a fool. He led several companies into financial ruin, chasing after an idea that could never be achieved. A designer who climbed too far, too fast, and was given undue praise, created the conditions for this failure. His own. But those shortcomings, the original quad mechs, while never amounting to the potential that he and his partners had dreamt of for them, still created something new, and something that found value somewhere else. Failure is a beautiful thing. Failure teaches lessons, and to the observers who learn from them, it can result in improvements, in refinements, and in executions. Like steel being beaten into shape at a forge, each strike has a purpose. Quad Battlemechs have been hardened and sharpened a great deal, and while they may not cut with the same ferocity as their competitors, they will leave a deadly wound all the same, when employed as they were intended. Do not judge yourself by the friends you have, but by the enemies you make. Thank you all for joining me here today. I hope you all enjoyed the quad mech video. This was originally planned as just being a Scorpion video, but as I started putting it together, I realized that I would have to mention the Xanthos. It made no sense not to mention the Goliath, and then things just kind of spiraled from there, and I was like, let's just make a quad video. Some of these mechs might show up in other videos, most notably the Revenant, but otherwise I wouldn't have covered most of these machines anyway. My original plan was just to cover the Scorpion and the Goliath, and nothing else. And I just think this was a much more productive and interesting exercise to go through, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Also, before I forget, there is a full list of resources I used to make this video that you will find in the top pinned comment. It has all of the technical readouts and any other resources I used to put this together. But this is now the part of the video where I get to do the really fun thing. Remember, if you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the like button, it does help. Or, as YouTube would prefer me to say, don't forget to smash the like button. Also, if you're new here, I produce a lot of Battletech content in the form of live streams and videos. So if you're enjoying them, don't forget to subscribe. You'll have a pretty good time. And I also just wanted to say as a fun fact, as of the making of this video, as of the deployment of this video, we are only a few dozen people away from hitting 30,000 subscribers on the channel. Thank you so much everyone for your support. I can't have imagined this many people enjoying what I do. And finally, I just want to thank all of the channel's members. For real, you guys are absolutely incredible. I can't thank you guys enough for your support. This content is really only made possible because of viewers like you. So thank you to all of the YouTube channel members for your support. And with all of that said, what did you guys think of the quads video? Do you think I was too harsh? Do you think I was fair? Did you enjoy the content within? Did you enjoy some of the mechs I covered? Let me know in the comments section below, and I will catch you all there.